Hey everyone, it's Samuel.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons.
Today in the Prime Material, an introduction to the podcast in collaborative storytelling.
In the wilds, the Kua-Toa.
And in the tavern, what would you do if a sinkhole suddenly opened up in a quiet mining town?
Let's go. So what's up, Matt?
I'm doing good. Having a good day so far. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. Ready to get our new podcast underway. So everybody, welcome to Plot Hooks. This is the podcast where we're going to be focusing a lot on collaborative storytelling within Dungeons & Dragons. There's not just us two. We also have our whole D&D group of Steve and Dave and Zach, as well as Becca and podcast pupper Ellie behind all of us here at the podcast. But just as a little way of introduction for ourselves, we've both been DMs and PCs alike, and actually currently we are both DMing and our PCs in each other's campaigns at the moment.
Yes, we are.
Yeah, it's we really enjoy Dungeons & Dragons, and we're inspired to begin making this podcast where we just focus a lot on, as it says in the introduction, the art of narrative and the art of collaborative storytelling. Before we get into that, just a quick reminder to follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. You can also access our website through our podcast hosting site, Buzzsprout. And also support us on Patreon. We've got more things coming out there soon. And of course, also remember that whenever we hit 250 followers on Twitter, we are giving away a random follower a D&D sourcebook of their choice. So whether or not you want to start your collection with the Monster Manual or their Player's Handbook, or you want the latest Eberron Rising from the Last War, we'll get you whichever one you choose to a random follower once we hit 250. Collaborative storytelling is really an art form. Mike Merles in the Player's Handbook wrote, "Playing D&D is an exercise in collaborative creation. You and your friends create epic stories filled with tension and memorable drama. You create silly in-jokes that make you laugh years later. The dice will be cruel to you, but you will soldier on. Your collective creativity will build stories that you will tell again and again, ranging from the utterly absurd to the stuff of legend." Collaborative storytelling really is at the heart of Dungeons & Dragons, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's that collective creativity and that push and pull of creative ideas around the table. And the fact that you don't really... One thing I love about this game is that you don't come to win, really. Yes. Like, sometimes people do, but the main philosophy behind the game is that you come to have an experience together and to tell a story and share an experience with the people around the table.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you're very. There are certainly exceptions, and of course, if you enjoy that at your table, that's perfectly fine. But most people don't come to try to best the dungeon master or the other player characters, and most DMs don't come to the table to try to make life as difficult as possible on the PCs or to see how much they can work over the party. We're all playing together to tell a story. The PCs and the DM are all working in unison to craft a narrative. And our goal in this podcast is to talk about ways that groups can build deeper narratives and hone this craft of collaborative storytelling so that your group can tell the most enjoyable narrative that you can. Of course, every group does things differently. That's the beauty of D&D. It's so flexible. These discussions are not meant as rules. They're just designed to prompt ideas and share tips which we've come across in our experience, which may be as of benefit as you and your party tell the most fantastic story you can.
Right, and with that in mind, we thought for our first episode, we would highlight a few mistakes we have made over the years of playing D&D, both as player characters and as DMs.
Yes.
Both
made many.
Yes, but mistakes which have harmed the process of collaborative storytelling for our groups across different games and campaigns we have played.
Yeah, it's really... different mistakes. We all make mistakes at the table. We forget an ability. We mess up a dice roll. We roll a d6 when it was a d8. We all do that sort of stuff all the time. But there are different things that we all do which can really harm the ability of the party to tell the best story they can. And many of these topics we're going to cover in depth at a later time where we can discuss different mistakes that we've made in great detail. But for now, for our introductory episode, we just wanted to provide a bit of, as you mentioned, past experience that we've had in different mistakes that we've made, which have harmed the collaborative storytelling effort of our different parties. Number one is just over-controlling the narrative.
Right.
And this can happen from both PCs and DMs. I think we normally think of it as a DM issue.
Right, railroading, right?
Yeah.
That's what, when you think over-controlling the narrative, you think, the DM puts you in a room with one path and says, go that direction,
Absolutely. Yeah, and I know I've certainly done that as well. And then it can also happen with PCs, where a player character can railroad their specific quest into the party's objectives, so much so that the campaign becomes so focused on a particular PC that it stunts the character development and the storytelling opportunities of the other PCs in the party.
Right.
And they become essentially side characters of the main person of the campaign, and neither of those options is really ideal.
Yeah, it really is. Well, I think it's interesting because I know I have a lot of experience in terms of kind of over-controlling the narrative from a DM perspective, and I think we should touch on that. But I also think it's really important as a player to think about this because I know something that I've thought about is that when most people, especially early on, when they build D&D characters, something they tend to do is what I say is that they build Aragorn, right, from Lord of the Rings. I have seen lots of backstories, and this isn't just in my own groups, but just from talking with other people, of they have this their village got burned down when they were a kid, and now they're off to kill the Demon King, or they're also a secret heir of a throne, that kind of a thing. And those elements are fine for protagonist, but what makes D&D is always an ensemble piece. If this is a movie, it's an ensemble cast at all times. You don't really have a protagonist. So characters that are designed around a protagonist style quest don't tend to gel well with the party.
Yes.
So I think that that's something that I have seen a lot that is worth thinking on if you're going to be playing in a game.
Yeah, definitely something as you're discussing, especially with your DM as you're rolling your character. You have these different options that you might want to integrate into your character's backstory, but some of them, even if the DM at his discretion allows you to utilize those elements of your backstory, like being an heir to a throne or having some sort of really powerful or rich family behind you, you have to make sure that doesn't, as the gameplay goes out, as your story is being told, that doesn't become the overarching point of the narratives. That doesn't become what your character's trying to do at all times, and you're not interacting with the other party members. Because not only will that stunt their character growth, it'll also stunt the party's character growth, because the party doesn't come together as we so often see in the best collaborative storytelling moments where the party comes together to face a threat or to accomplish a quest or to clear a dungeon. The party doesn't grow closer together. The party, in some ways, can even begin resenting the particular PC that is railroading their particular backstory to such a high degree.
Right. And I do think what you said earlier is really important in that this is something you need to talk with your DM about, and also I think your other players about. Communication is the most important thing in pretty much anything, but especially in D&D. And I am increasingly becoming a fan of just talking about the narrative with my other players. Of just saying, hey, like, I have an idea for a character. And, like, this is actually something in an upcoming game you're going to be running. Me and another player were talking about our characters, and I said, okay, so maybe we've met before, maybe we haven't, I don't know. But, like, how do you think our characters will interact? And we had a little bit of discussion about it. And I think I find it interesting. A lot of people seem very reticent. Everyone seems to build their characters in isolation and then bring them to the table. And because of that, first sessions especially can be a mess of conflicting motivations and whatnot. But I think it's great to talk about your characters and beforehand so you can know, like, you know, for example, upcoming game, I'm going to be playing a druid and someone else is playing a sorcerer that's sort of a Cthulhu-esque abomination kind of person. And we had a discussion of, hey, how do our characters interact? Is it hostile? Is it friendly? Do we know what's going on? And because we've had that conversation, the collaboration will be much smoother when the game starts.
Yeah, I think whenever you're starting a campaign, we really enjoy the surprise. We enjoy, and there certainly is a place for that. And depending on the way that your particular campaign is beginning, that can be more or less easy to actually do. But actually talking about and having different characters know each other can really help facilitate the start of a campaign and your collaborative storytelling effort. And if you begin discussing the different interactions between PCs, and even if you don't know each other beforehand, doing that after the first session outside of game, it can help with your interactions and prevent one player from over-controlling the narrative.
Right, and the last note here maybe on this point from the PC side of things at least, is that I think what we just talked about, this developing kind of camaraderie and an understanding of character relations between the player characters is really helpful. And you don't have to spill all the beans, but it's really helpful to later dramatic reveals. Like, so for example, if you have that connection with your party and things are going along well and you have a good dynamic, you can drop a bomb and say, oh, by the way, you're the heir of an ancient throne. And if your party has been connected by enough character work and camaraderie, like, that's not going to derail the campaign because at that point the characters have an understanding of each other and the players have an understanding.
Absolutely.
And people are going to interact much better if the narrative starts to evolve in a surprising direction like that.
Yeah, absolutely. From the DM perspective, you use the term railroading. That's what you set a track and you force the players to stay on a track. And that's not to say that as DMs we're not supposed to set a track.
Oh no, not at all.
Because there absolutely has to be a track, there has to be a story, there has to be preparation, but making sure that you don't force characters down a specific direction is a trap that I think every DM has fallen into at a certain point, where there's this particular story that you really want to tell, but as the game is progressing, you can tell that your PCs are really interested in another aspect of the world that you've created, and we have to be humble enough and caring enough for the players playing our game to actually be flexible and to let them explore and tell the story that they want to tell. You know, as DMs, we are not the storyteller. We are, in some ways, the guide of the story, or perhaps to put it another way, we are the steward of the story. But we do not tell the story exclusively. It is a collaborative effort. Your players affect your world. Your players build your world as they're building their backstories. You get to figure out, okay, this person is. We had a character named Ivan who was a paladin in one of our previous campaigns, and his family was made barrel hoops. They were. In fact, his last name was Hooper, and so that added an element to a particular city that I had created, where there's this barrel industry, where this family is running this large factory of actually manufacturing barrels, and that's just a very little tiny example, but these things fill out your world, and don't shy away from that. Don't shy away from your players saying things in game that you've never considered and just writing them down as canon. Just let your players actually tell the story with you.
Yeah, and I was in that game where Ivan was, and while like the fact that that town or that city now has a thriving barrel industry didn't really affect the plot, it did lead to a really great little moment in that game where we went as a party and stayed with or he went back to his house and stayed with his brother. My character wasn't involved in that scene, but I got to see him play out that scene of talking with his brother, and it was a great little narrative moment. So allowing, even if it's not huge, allowing little details like that are really, they really do fill out the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for my own part in Overcontrolling the Narrative, one thing I think that can be a problem is designing an adventure that has too specific a ending. So very early on, most of my RPG experience is with the Star Wars RPG system, but very early on I built up, it might have been my first session of running it, I built up a sort of a boss encounter at the end of our first session, and I wanted them to have a cool moment. Maybe this is how I should phrase it, is that instead of building situations and allowing cool moments to happen, I tried to manufacture cool and interesting moments. So what I wanted them to do was to find this particularly dangerous droid and then use an explosive to blow out a window to like suck it out into hyperspace or something like that, which is a cool scene and all, but it required me nudging my players in too specific a direction. And that encounter ended up just failing horribly because they didn't pick up the hints I had dropped of how they were supposed to win. And that was a good lesson for me in learning how to run games, is that I had created too specific a solution. And then, and it wasn't a solution like, we have an evil dark lord who can only be killed by a dagger that bears his soul or something like that. Like, that's fine because that's part of an overarching plot, and they need the weapon, and it's part of the adventure.
Multi-episode arc.
Exactly, and they have a reasonable way to get that information. Creating an encounter that has, like, one exact solution and then being frustrated when your players don't happen upon that solution is something that I have done too often early on in my DMing, and I've seen other DMs do. And it creates a lot of frustration.
Yeah, and I've done it as well. It's the idea is whenever we come to play Dungeons and Dragons, we are oftentimes looking to become heroes. And as DMs, sometimes we try to, as you were doing in that encounter in your Star Wars game, you're trying to make the PCs heroes rather than letting them actually tell their own stories and become heroes of their own right.
Right.
And I certainly have tried to force people in that sort of direction as well. where you're trying to force them to actually take up this mantle instead of, hey, they might be in a situation in their particular story where they're down, they just lost a fight, they might not feel very heroic. They might choose, if you allow them to bypass an entire encounter, to choose not to rescue this town that's been being ransacked because they don't feel able to defend, and we have to be cognizant at all times as DMs and even as PCs that it's all about the collaboration, and we can't just railroad a specific narrative into the ground, because that's where it will end up. It will end up in the ground, and it will create a much less rewarding experience for everyone involved.
Maybe a good maxim to close this out might be create opportunities and not demands as a DM.
Yeah, absolutely.
Opportunities for your characters to be heroic, or opportunities for them to develop the narrative, but not demands of how they should do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Another way that I think we can make mistakes as DMs is not preparing enough, and this is for DMs and for PCs. For DMs, I know in my own experience, there's been times where I have not prepared, and that has really dropped people out of the story. That has allowed certain threads that could have really been fleshed out and just gone by the wayside. And whenever we don't prepare, what I find us doing as DMs is, if we don't prepare other options or other things like that, we end up railroading and over-controlling the narrative by our lack of preparation, because there's only one real story that we've actually fleshed out. Not to say that everything has to be fleshed out, but I think having certain options that can be explored, having pre-built NPCs at your disclosure, just in case they want to divert to this town in order to be able to interact with some shopkeepers and some NPCs. If they want to go back to their own hometown, working even before the game begins with a specific PC to actually build out a little bit of what's there, rather than having to just completely improvise. Improvisation is a huge part of being a dungeon master, and this is not to diminish that at all, but some amount of preparation is necessary in order to make sure that the narrative does not stagnate, to make sure that the narrative is flowing, and also to make sure that your narrative doesn't get bogged down in searching up the player's handbook and monster manual rules all the time, because you all of a sudden had to do this thing and now you're not sure how this rule works because you weren't aware of how this interaction would work. And I think that it's important to actually be prepared as a DM in whatever ways that actually manifests itself within your specific setting and group and how you specifically play, because otherwise I think it can end up really bogging down the narrative.
Yeah, I know for me, there have been plenty of times where I have just kind of run into a session and said, I'll wing it. And, sometimes that's really worked out and I've had a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. A lot of times, though, it's a lot of me flipping through books and trying to scramble to bring up NPCs that I'm inventing on the fly. Mm-hmm. And it really does bog things down. So the more preparation you can do, the better. And here's a bit of advice, a situation I've had a few times. I think it is always better. Always, if you realize that you're in a situation you're unprepared for, mm-hmm. to stop the game and look at your table and say, guys, can I take 5 or 10 minutes, 10 minutes here, to think through things and write some notes down real fast. Yeah. I've done that. I had a specific scenario where I was playing a game and a character made a charisma roll that completely changed. I had this huge... I'd actually done a fair amount of preparation that time. I had this huge battle set up that was going to happen, and he made a charisma roll that almost nullified the entire situation. And I realized I wasn't going to have a session. And so I paused the game and said, okay, give me a minute. I need to think for a second and work some stuff out. So I actually went to the other room and jotted down some notes and did a quick brainstorming session while they ate pizza and drank and were laughing at the fact that, oh my gosh, we stumped Matt. They were having a great time out of, they had completely thrown me for a loop, and good for them, they earned it. So I think that is something that is always an option on the table.
Yeah. I mean, we all take breaks in the middle of sessions, don't we? Everybody.
Or you should if you don't.
Yeah, so everybody needs, a bathroom break or a break to break out more chips and pizza. We all use those things already, and as a DM, taking those opportunities or saying, "Hey guys, let's take one of those now," is going to make the rest of your session. If you find yourself in a situation where you're just completely unprepared for, is going to make it really, really good.
Yeah.
Especially, I mean, we are, you see on YouTube, you see all these sorts of videos, about how to be a better improviser as a DM. And that is a skill that, you develop as time goes on. I know whenever I first started, I was a pretty terrible improviser. And still struggle with it myself. I prefer being more prepared than actually being improvisational, but being willing to actually take a couple of minutes and actually prepare some options in your own mind can really help you tell a more cohesive and better collaborative story rather than just fumbling around for the entire session, and at the end no story has really ever been told. You didn't have to stop the story for a split second, but your story was actually a cohesive one, and one with actual progression, and one that your PCs are much more likely to actually enjoy. For the PC side of this, I think not preparing enough means not knowing your character.
Right.
And we've all had situations like this where we've come into a session where either we've just leveled up or just made a new character and we don't know how it works. And we spend the entire session pulling ourselves out of the narrative repeatedly, trying to figure out how to cast Fireball, or how exactly Vicious Mockery works, or does this spell trigger when I miss an attack, or just when I attack, or do I have to hit, or figuring out things like that, or not preparing or thinking enough actually about how your own character, who he is, or who she is, or who they are. It's just. The lack of preparation can bog down the storytelling.
Yeah, and this actually touches on something that I think we're probably going to come across multiple times in this podcast, is where mechanics meets narrative.
Absolutely.
Knowing your character is one of those points where mechanics meets narrative, and knowing, and you don't think that knowing how to cast Fireball isn't a narrative thing. Well, it actually is, because if you don't know how to cast Fireball and you have to stop the story and stop the game while you flip through a bunch of books and we have an argument about well, wait, how does spell attack work? Or no, it's this. Or wait, what's the save for that? You don't have to have absolute knowledge of the system.
Absolutely.
But
no one has the player's handbook memorized. So.
No, well, and if you do, God help you. But you don't have to have absolute knowledge, but you do need to have a good understanding of the essential makeup of your character, so that when you get into a fight or when something happens, the story can keep rolling.
Yes,
so this is one of those points where mechanics and narrative really are connected.
Absolutely. And the final topic of that we've dealt with as DMs and PCs is not trusting the dice.
Mm-hmm.
When we are telling our story, when we're having our collaborative story, the dice really are a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
The dice are the ones which determine whether or not our strength check in our competition at the carnival goes extremely well or extremely poorly. The dice really help tell the story. Otherwise, we can all just sit around and improv.
Mm-hmm.
The dice are a big element of the story. And sometimes as DMs, and then this goes back to overcontrolling the narrative again, we want it to go such a certain way when the dice start working against us. Instead of actually going with that flow, we start fudging more.
Mm-hmm.
We start fudging the dice rolls. We're like, oh no, but this needs to happen. So this guy can't die here. This is supposed to ramp into being my main villain. So he actually made this save. He rolled a nat 20, not a nat 1. And actually fudging rules behind the DM screen as part of actually over controlling the narrative. And I would just encourage everyone to let the dice be a part of telling your story. They're an integral element to the way that Dungeons and Dragons functions together as you're actually telling a story. I think that's pretty important.
Yeah, and this is, I know we're probably we're entering into some dangerous territory and some hornets' nests with saying not about how to trust the dice.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, my opinions on how much you should fudge or not fudge is shifting. I'm still learning as a DM.
Yeah.
And there are some situations where, if a fight is going on too long and you're fighting goblins and you can tell that your players are just so tired of fighting goblins, like I don't think you're failing as a DM if you say, oh wait, no, that hit, it's dead, we can move on now, know, when it didn't. But you should allow the dice to really to contribute, because otherwise, like you said, what are we doing? We're improving. Yeah. So that is something, and I feel like we probably will. I feel like the dice and the relationship between the DM as steward of the story and the DM as keeper of the rules, maybe, and how that works together is a topic we're going to have to come back to at some point in much greater detail, because it is complicated. There's lots of schools of thought on how it should function.
Yeah, and it's again these discussions that we're having, as we mentioned in the introduction to this section, they are very much just thoughts and ideas to prompt discussion and to prompt your own schools of thought within your group. There's no right or wrong way to do any of this. Find what works best for you and for your group. But with that being said, I think we might be coming to the end of the prime material. Are you ready to head off to the wilds?
I am ready to head off to the wilds. Let's go.
All right, let's go. So welcome to the wilds.
It's good to be out here in the wilderness.
Yeah, it's in this section where in each episode we're going to examine a specific 5e D&D creature and discuss how they can be utilized in a campaign narrative. Today we're going to be talking about the Kua-Toa.
Yeah, and the Kua-Toa are purplish amphibious humanoids with fish-like heads.
They sound great.
Yeah, I'm actually a big fan of these guys, and they've been around since first edition, and in my opinion, are criminally underrated in the amount of story potential that they have.
Yeah, just reading through their background, and you could tell a little bit that in the Monster Manual for 5th edition, they actually have, I think, 3 pages which cover them, which is a decent amount of lore for a creature, with 3 different stat blocks for 3 different levels of monsters. And what about a little bit of background for what exactly the Kua-Toa are, what these freaky fish people are?
Sure. So, long ago, Kua-Toa were driven underground by other humanoids, away from their initial dwellings along the coastlines. But they ended up in the Underdark, and unfortunately, Kua-Toa were captured en masse by mind flayers. The Illithid oppression drove the Kua-Toa insane. The Monster Manual uses the phrase, shattered beyond repair, to refer to their psyches. They were eventually abandoned by the mind flayers, and the Kua-Toa were left mad, lost, and alone in the Underdark.
Yes, they're essentially they're described as simple beings, and it just sounds like they, after however long it was of just this psychic oppression by the Illithids, they just ended up just completely mad, stuck in the Underdark. They can't go outside anymore. They're extremely sensitive to sunlight, and they're just left there without anything, and so they turned to religious fanaticism, and they literally began inventing gods of their own in order to gain some protection from outside threats and enemies. But here's the thing that's so interesting about them is that it worked. They didn't just, invent, here's this thing that we worship now, let's make an idol of it, and we go from there. It would seem that somehow, and it's not really explained, at least not in 5th edition, that this psychic slavery that the Kua-Toa experienced at the hands of the Illithids actually gave them some sort of psionic ability, and if they actually, enough of the Kua-Toa believe in it, in an entity, in a deity, they will actually manifest it to life. And the most prominent example of this is Blip Dool Poop.
Blip Dool Poop.
Yeah, it just sounds like dripping of water. But it's Blip Dool Poop, the sea mother, who is essentially like half crayfish, half female humanoid. She's got a crayfish head and crayfish's claws, but the body of a female human. And the Monster Manual points out that it is probably originally invented by a Kua-Toa that built a statue by taking a broken human statue form and adding on features of various crayfish and lobsters that they may have encountered in the Underdark, and creating this entity, and then so this certain segment of Kua-Toa began worshiping it, so much so that with whatever psychic ability that they have, actually manifested this deity into life. And they're just really interesting creatures, and I think provide excellent opportunities for telling stories.
Yeah, and what I really like about the Kua-Toa is that, one, they have a really interesting ability of bringing deity-like beings into existence, which is really interesting, and I want to touch on that a little bit more later in a minute, But one of the things I really like about them is that they can operate at almost... They're very flexible. They can operate in a lot of different ways. So, for example... normally when I've heard people talk about Kua-Toa, they normally bring up Lovecraft. They see the Kua-Toa as a sort of reference to the Shadow over Innsmouth and his fish people. And there is something kind of creepy and Lovecraftian about them. So you could use them as the antagonist in sort of a horror type adventure where you can emphasize the creepiness of them. The other interesting thing, though, is that they're also very silly looking.
Yes.
And kind of are inherently designed to be silly, and so you can ignore the sort of ramifications of their abilities and use them as something absurd. Or, and this is something I really am shocked I haven't seen more of, is really emphasizing the psychic ability to manifest beings.
Yeah.
Because that is you can run a campaign off of, Kua-Toa have gotten, are working together somehow and are manifesting these chaotic, nonsensical gods that are threatening to rip reality apart. You know?
No, you literally could have a campaign where these Kua-Toa are actually in the Underdark underneath a particular settlement or city.
Sure.
And their whole community of worshippers are actually beginning to cause effects on the surface world because of everything that they're doing underground. And it can be a whole storyline of PCs coming to this particular location, hearing of all these strange things, and eventually finding their way underground, dealing with all the minion Kua-Toas, and then fighting Kua-Toa whips and Kua-Toa archpriests, and it can be an actual whole at least arc of a particular campaign.
Sure, and one of the things that's always I really like is that Kua-Toa are very easily manipulated. It mentions that they often find themselves worshiping, I think, aboleths, and are completely unaware that they're being manipulated. So you could use them as a great stepping stone, or even as a main device by a much more powerful antagonist who is manipulating Kua-Toa to create whatever being he wants to manifest.
Yeah.
So to use them as pawns. And so you could have that as a great lead-in where they're finding all these strange events. They find out Kua-Toa are behind it, but then you slowly start to unravel that someone was manipulating the Kua-Toa.
Yeah.
And then that leads you off into, whoever your grand villain of your campaign is. You know?
Yeah, and they're also, depending on what setting you're using and how you want to homebrew it, you could technically come across the Kua-Toa at any point in their descent into insanity.
Oh, that's a good point.
You could come across them where your main villain of your particular campaign or arc is the Illithids, is a mind flayer, and you can come across them either perhaps they've just been abandoned, perhaps they are just becoming mad, and they might even become allies of sorts against the Illithids. You could come across them at really any stage of this psychic slavery that they are undergoing, and actually use them in some pretty unique ways against the primary antagonist.
No, that's a great. I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't thought about putting them further back in their timeline, because that's a great way to run a. Because the Illithids are great villains. I'm sure we'll talk about them at some point.
Yeah, they're so classic.
Yeah, they're so classic. But Mind Flayers is such a great villain that you can have a really classic antagonist, and then have this interesting twist of you have a species that's mid-descent into madness, and can your players reverse the process? Can they at least save some of them? Is it a tragic story where it's unreversible? Is it a hopeful story where maybe you can save at least a colony of sane Kua-Toa? That could be a really engrossing story.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so you ready to head back to the tavern?
Let's go to the tavern.
All right. So let's head on into the tavern.
All right.
Yeah, in this section, in each episode, as we're coming to the end, we're going to talk about a random plot hook and how it might be utilized in a campaign. So what did you say at the beginning of the episode?
What I said at the beginning was, what would you do if a sinkhole suddenly appeared in a quiet mining town?
This is interesting to me. I feel like there's many different ways you could go with this. And I think this would be a great storytelling opportunity if a venturing party that's just kind of on their way somewhere else and just happen to be passing through a town or a village, a quiet mining town. If you drop this in, I think you can get a good couple of sessions off of just a really interesting plot point as you're on your way to something else. Perhaps you have a portion of this mine that collapsed, and the party can uncover that maybe an illegal form of mining was going on. It provides a great opportunity for gaining treasure while they're down there too. Going after some gems, or depending on what kind of ore or precious metal was being actually mined down there. It provides a good opportunity if you're going that direction.
Yeah, well, and also if it's an issue of illegal mining, that can be an opportunity for more social characters in your party to have a chance to engage in something that isn't just random monster slaying. But if we wanted some monster slaying, the party could discover the cave-in was caused by some kind of nefarious force, maybe something connected to the Underdark.
Yeah, it could have collapsed into a Kua-Toa lair for all that we know. It could also be you could use this to connect to a larger plot of your campaign involving the Underdark. A random sinkhole like this in the middle of a mine, monsters coming up into the mine or something along those lines is a good way to introduce your players to the Underdark if the story that you've been creating is looking like it's heading in that direction.
Yeah, well, and also this could also be a good way to introduce, you could have a maybe it's a small search party of drow who were searching out tunnels and made a mistake, and now you have drow, in the mining tunnels, something like that.
Yeah. Also, we love in Dungeons and Dragons our ruins. It could be a collapse that leads into some sort of ancient ruin hidden in the ground that now the players get to uncover. Perhaps that even leads into something that's been going on with the town, where maybe something was happening actually with the city. And now you get to uncover the cause of it. And that could be an even longer little arc that you could have from this random encounter.
Well, and with almost any of these ideas, a good hook to get your characters into that sinkhole is that it's a rescue operation. Somebody fell in or was captured. Maybe it's a race against time, either because they were captured by drow or Kua-Toa or something, or maybe there's water from a nearby river is pouring in, and it's a race against time to save whoever was down there before it fills up and they drown. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with it. Yeah,
you could even have just thinking about it just now, you could have a race against time, just even against air. You could depending on how they're trapped and where they're trapped, you could have two different levels of a race against time, depending on whether it's something that's pretty quickly, whereas water is getting into it. That's probably a one session thing because water is going to fill it up pretty fast.
Right.
Versus something like air where, you are aware that if they're just stuck in a cavern somewhere, they only have a few days before they're going to run out of air and food. And it can end up in a rescue operation like that.
Yeah, well, and in that last example about air is great because you could combine something about Underdark monsters in an ancient ruin, and somewhere at the end of this ancient ruin is, a group of miners who need help, which allows you to do some great classic D&D dungeon delving, but with a real heroic purpose at the end.
Yeah. That's a great opportunity to tell a story.
Yeah.
Well, with that, I think we're going to bring this episode to a close. Want to say thanks to everyone here at Plot Hooks. Thanks, Matt, for being the co-host today. And, of course, I'm Samuel. And thanks also from Dave and Mike and Zach and Becca and, of course, podcast pupper Ellie. We will see you all next week as we continue this foray into the podcast of Plot Hooks.